y'all. How y'all doing out there? It's kind of a bummer we all had to go out to our different parts in the country and get out there. I hope everybody's safe. What we thought we'd do, I got Pete Erb here, our illustrious coordinator of science communication, and we put our heads together, and what we thought we'd do is keep you all connected to this place. And we're going to take a nature walk, and we're going to get out, talk about invasive species, talk about light, talk about some different plants we see, give you all a way to be connected to Warren Wilson, which is really important. You know, I want you all to stay safe. I want you all to stay comfortable out there. Getting out in the woods is a great thing right now. Just keep in mind when you're on single track, you know, it's kind of hard to stay a distance away from people, kind of get off the trail and let other people get around you. This is a funny time for me. You know, my wife says I should have no problem with all of this because I practice social distancing as a life skill. I don't know about that, but we're all going to take care of each other. We're all going to be safe, and things will keep going at the college. But right now, what I wanted to do was take you all up to Broyles Ridge. This is the Broyles Ridge compartment behind us. For you alums, you probably have a place in your heart for when it was called Suicide Ridge. No, it's not called Suicide Ridge for any morbid reason. It wasn't called Suicide Ridge. There's two stories behind that. One is that there's a water cistern up here, and students had to carry water up and down this hill, and they called it Suicide Ridge for that reason. Probably more likely is the cross-country coach. I don't know if that was Dean Call or not at the time, but the cross-country coach used to make them run up and down the hill for suicide, so it was called Suicide Ridge. We've renamed it to Broyles Ridge. Broyles Ridge because we had a donor who was connected to the Dorland School, and she was a woman from Kentucky who really took value in this forest. She owned a tree farm, and she donated a large amount of money to the forestry program, and so we thought it appropriate to name Broyles Ridge after her. So let's head up into the forest, and we'll talk a little bit about probably invasive species first. So this is a spot where we have all of the culprits here, all of the usual suspects on invasive species. We have multiflora rose here with these compound leaves, this vining species with the thorns. We have vinca minor down here on the ground. We have autumn olive, Elaeagnus. Autumn olive is an interesting one. You can tell autumn olive by the backs of the leaves are silvery. And actually, this is a great bird food, and our students are starting to make fruit leather out of the berries from this, which is really tasty, actually. We also have honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle here. This is a vining species here that has these opposite leaves, and it vines onto the trees. We have English ivy over here. English ivy that everybody knows. Anyone who's tried to get rid of English ivy knows how difficult that is. So when you think about invasive species, I actually have a perspective on invasive species, which I believe in another 10, 20 years, a couple decades, will get a little more accepted. But right now, some of you listening and watching might think I'm absolutely crazy. I believe a lot of these invasive species that we have to deal with, we're just going to have to learn how to live with them down the road, especially with climate change. A lot of these invasive species, take multiflora rose for instance, can provide wildlife habitat. It can provide stream stabilization. Now I want to be careful here. When I talk about invasive species and having to live with them, it's not the species that we need to think about. We don't need to think about managing the species. We need to think about managing these species at acceptable levels for different sites. Obviously, if we have an area that has high economic value, that has high biodiversity value, high cultural value, special ecosystems, we should do whatever we can to keep invasive species out of those. But in some of these high impacted human areas, there's nothing we can really do short of wholesale herbiciding to get rid of these species. And I would argue, and many of you could argue with me, I would argue that the amount of herbicide we're putting into the system in what seems to be a losing battle in many situations might be worse for the ecosystem than the invasive species themselves. A couple interesting species to think about is this vinca right here and English ivy. How many of you have been out in the woods hiking and have come across a beautiful blueberry bush just out in the woods, or daylilies out in the woods, or English ivy just out in the woods? And I'm not talking a trailhead, I'm talking out there. When you come across those species, daylilies, blueberry bushes, cultivated blueberry bushes, English ivy, and vinca, what you're probably in is an old house, somebody's front yard from Europe. Look for a foundation in the area, and you'll probably be in what was somebody's front yard garden, and they brought these plants from Europe and planted them, which is pretty interesting to find. Now, when you do find that, especially if you're up in New England right now, the one thing, what might you want to look for besides a foundation? I'll give you a second. And those of you who've been on hikes with me, you can't answer. You might want to look for a well hole, right? Because if you're in an old homestead, there's probably an old well hole around you want to fall in. And if you find one well hole, what you want to look for is a second well hole, because any good farmer at that time would have had 2 wells around their house. Great, let's move on and talk about trees. Okay. Okay. Here's an interesting adaptation. If you look at this, this is burning bush. This is another invasive species. But if you look at it, it has these corky structures along the branch. You can see them all along the branch here. Those of you who are in the Piedmont of North Carolina right now, you'll see this on sweet gum. Sweet gum trees have this. This is what this is. Anybody have any idea what this might be for? Well, I'll tell you what it's for. Actually, what this is to inhibit herbivory. Deer and mammals that would chew on this won't like these corky structures. And so it'll help avoid browsing by herbivores. But one of the really interesting things is with these trees, you'll notice, even with your sweet gum, that once those trees get above browse height, they'll stop producing these because they're above the area where the animals will actually graze on them. So people always ask me when I'm in the woods, hey Dave, how old is that tree? Right? They'll see a big old tree out in the forest and they'll say, how old is that tree? I can tell you right now that the size of a tree isn't a really good indicator of the age of the tree, okay? Especially if you're looking between 2 different species because of different growth rates. But even within a single species, whether it was open grown, whether it was grown in the forest, quite frankly, one of the easiest ways to tell how old a tree is the form of the tree. Sometimes you can look up and you can have a large tree that's got a beautiful crown that's in nice shape, but if it's kind of funky and the crown's broken and it's growing at some weird angles, sometimes that'll indicate that it's an older tree. But I want to point out these 2 trees that I'm standing with here. Anyone know what this tree is? This is an American beech tree, and this is a tulip poplar right here. So this is a good example of which tree do you think is older? The tulip poplar or the American beech? Again, if you've been on a hike with me, you can't answer this question. They're actually probably about the same age. Broyles Ridge compartment where we are, this is one of our oldest forest compartments. It's about 85, maybe, 85, 90 years old for the most part. So these trees are probably the same age within a couple years. Now I want to be careful. A tree that's 85 and a tree that's 80 are the same age, right? We think of trees being the same age if they came into the forest and grew after the same disturbance. So last time this was cut, these two trees are the trees that came in with the other trees at that time. So the difference is tulip poplar is a shade intolerant tree and a fast growing tree. So beech is a tree that's very shade tolerant. It can live in the shade, so it grows very slow. The rings on this tree are going to be wide, where the rings on this tree are going to be very thin. This brings up a point that I bring up to my students quite often, and when I talk about managing forests, what I actually manage when you're managing East Coast forests, think about it this way. Fly over an East Coast forest. You're in an airplane, you're flying over an East Coast forest, and it's an intact forest. What do you see when you look out the window? You see a closed canopy, right? You see tree canopies all closed together. You don't see the ground if it's an intact forest. Fly over northern Arizona, an intact forest in northern Arizona. When you fly over that forest, what you're going to see is you're going to see trees, but you're also going to see the ground because the trees are widely spaced. This forest on the East Coast is a light-limited forest. What that means is there's plenty of moisture on the ground for these trees in the soil. What they're all competing for is light up here. Who's going to be the winner? Who's going to get the light up top? If you go out west where it's arid, out there what you're managing is moisture. The tree roots are all connected together underneath, but the trees have to grow farther apart because there's not enough moisture, but there's plenty of light. So really what I talk about here as managing in the East Coast is I'm really a light manager. When I'm managing a forest and trying to decide when to thin, when to cut, which species I want, what I'm really doing is managing light. How much light do I want to let hit the forest floor will dictate the types of species I'm going to get in the next forest. So it's really light that we play with here, the palette of light. So as an example, what do you look when you see these two trees? What do you notice different about their structure when you go up and down the tree? What you should notice is that this tree here has lost all its lower branches, which is pretty typical for the majority of the trees you see in an older stand. Whereas this tree has kept its lower branches, right? This beech has kept its lower branches. And that's because beech is very, very shade tolerant. Beech can live in the understory with low light levels because respiration is very low, and so it doesn't take a lot of photosynthesis to be above respiration. Whereas a tree like tulip poplar can't keep these lower branches because to keep those alive, it would have to take energy from the tree and put it into the leaves and branches. Here, with these beech leaves can photosynthesize at such a low light level that they're actually able to add energy to the tree, right? So they'll do that. So you see these trees with lower branches. When you go out in the forest and you see these large trees, I'm not talking shrubs, but if you see these large trees with lower branches, you know that that's a shade tolerant tree, right? Compared to a shade intolerant tree that loses its lower branches. Another cool story about this, ever notice that a lot of oaks keep their leaves during the winter, even though they're dead? That is a trait of the Fagaceae family. The beeches, the oaks, and a couple of the birches, the carpinus, the musselwood. Henry David Thoreau said that the beeches and the oaks were the stubbornest of all trees. They keep last year's leaves until this year's leaves knock them off. And everybody asks, what's the ecological benefit of keeping these? I've heard lots of stories. It breaks down wind, it protects the buds, but generally speaking, I don't have an answer for it. I haven't heard a good one yet. And you can tell the American beech by these really long buds, really long pointed buds. So if you look around up that hill, Pete is going to do a great job of panning up the hill. Can you spot the shade tolerant tree up the hill by form? Not the beech up there in the distance, a different species. You should be looking at this holly right here. See this holly right here? See how it's keeping its lower branches compared to, say, the red maple that's right behind it? That's because, again, it's a shade-tolerant tree, so it's able to persist in a low-light environment. You know, dendrologists, people who study trees and identify trees, the world breaks down to who's got opposite leaves and who's got alternate leaves. For silviculturists like me, it breaks down, the whole world breaks down to, are you shade tolerant or are you shade intolerant? And that's how we work, that's where we start from designing and managing forests. Great. Hey, somebody asked me, I went into the farm office this morning and one of the students said this was the coolest shirt ever, which I agree, it's the coolest shirt ever. But does anybody know what this is? I will take genus. Many of you will know genus, but I'm wondering if any of you will know species. This is actually a Mexican axolotl, right? It's an ambystoma. It's in the same family as the spotted salamander, the tiger salamander, the marble salamander. This is Mexicana. This is the ambystoma mexicana. This is the Mexican axolotl. I had one for 18 years, believe it or not. 18 years I had one. And the student asked me what was its name. And she was a little taken back because I said I didn't name it. You never name cold-blooded animals, right? I didn't expect it to live 18 years, but it did. So I'm going to run off in the woods and I'm going to point to something and I want you to take a look. You know, forest forensics, one of the things I try to teach is that when you see a forest, how can you tell what's going on in the future? How can you tell different structures? So as Pete pans down here, I want you to focus on most of these tall, straight trees, but then I want you to take a look at this guy here. See this bent up, kind of funky, snaky tree right here that's out. And I can tell you right now that when you look at that stem, rather than being round, that stem is oval. It's shaped like this. So those of you who might think about timber, those of you who might think about forestry, what do you think that tree is worth for timber compared to, say, this white oak that's right next to it? Not a heck of a lot, right? So that's a sourwood. That's a sourwood tree. Sourwoods serve a really, really important function in the forest. They add structure. When you think about diversity in a forest or any ecosystem, but we'll stick with forest now. When I think about diversity in a forest, I think of three types of diversity. Species diversity, which species are out there and how many of them. I think about functional diversity. How many decomposers do you have? How many trees do you have that might provide wildlife habitat, either forage or food? So how many different functions do you have out there? And structural diversity. How structurally diverse is that forest? And what I mean by that is any of you who have ever been in a pure pine stand know that there's not a lot of structural diversity. Longleaf pine, you have beautiful compositional diversity on the ground and a very rich understory, but then you could have 100-foot trees with one canopy across the top. Low diversity, low structural diversity. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That works for that system. But in these mixed forests like this, having multiple layers of vegetation has been shown to provide niches for a higher diversity of, say, bird habitat. Right? The more layers you have, the more different niches and the more opportunities you have for wildlife. Sourwood is really important in this forest because it typically grows in this mid-story and it grows funky and snaky and broken and twisted. And whereas you have tulip poplars with these straight, intact boles, they don't provide a lot of structural habitat, where here you can have gleaning birds, they get holes in them, cavity nesters go in them. So they're really, really important for structural habitat, for places and niches for animals to hide in and forage on. One of the things I worry about right now is the push for biomass for fuel, using wood biomass for fuel. Before people got really interested in biomass, when you came through and cut a forest for timber, trees like that would have been left because they wouldn't be valuable for timber, right? You can't make a board out of that. But can you burn that? Can you pelletize it and burn it? Yes. So what's happening now that I worry about is if we go through the forest for timber, for the nice straight trees for timber, but then we come back through the forest again and take a lot of the trees that don't have timber value but have biomass value, we could really liquidate a lot of our wildlife habitat through looking for that resource. So I think it's a thing to be careful about. I'm not saying it should never be done, but it's something that we really have to think about when we're looking at the different values of trees and wood out in the forest. Here's one of our first plants to come up in the spring. This is toothwort. This is a great plant, beautiful plant. Some of you might have seen it. Sometimes the leaves are a little more red. It has these four petaled flowers here. Toothwort has a history in both Cherokee and Anglo history in this area. And the lore is that you could take the root and stem, a little bit of the leaf, and if you have a toothache, you can pack it into your tooth and it'll numb out your toothache. Disclaimer, my specialty with medicinal plants is the cultivation, the growth, the ecology, and management. Do not stick this in your mouth and your teeth because I said you should. Read a book. Get it from somebody who is an expert on homeopathic remedies. But the folklore and most of the literature said it was used for that purpose. And it's a pretty plant. It's up now. We may see some other plants that come up early. Bloodroot's another very early plant. Another one is ramps. I've seen ramps up. I don't know if we'll find any here. So those are a couple plants. And trilliums will probably be coming up, although they won't be flowering yet. Those of you who hike regularly on our forest will notice that you might think we don't take care of the trails as well on Broyles Ridge as we do in some of the other forested areas around here, other forested trails. But we have a reason for that. Broyles Ridge is our oldest forest, and if we make it to the other side today, or maybe tomorrow we will, I'll show you a beautiful Appalachian Rich Cove forest that's pretty intact. So this area here has some of our highest diversity. It's some of our oldest forest. And so what we've really done here is close this area to timber harvest. We're not harvesting timber up on Broyles Ridge anymore. We're going to let it go. We're going to let it go to get, we call it a future late successional reserve. We're going to let this forest go and get into later stages so that we can use it as a classroom for demonstrating late successional forest management. So when you look and you see these trees down and you think, wow, why aren't they getting rid of these? We want to leave these trees. We're going to cut them open for the trail. But again, this isn't a dead tree. This is habitat. This is habitat for a long time. This is habitat for mushrooms. This is denning habitat for small mammals. In the winter, a lot of rodents will eat the mycelial hyphae that grow at the ground contact between the tree and the ground. It's also carbon storage sitting there that's not put into the atmosphere. So we let this go. And you know, some people will say, but you have some trees up here that have value, right? There's some trees up here that have timber value. I always counter that we're not going to lose the value of these trees if we don't harvest them. We're just thinking about a different value, right? We're thinking about the educational value. We're thinking about the wildlife value. We're thinking about the aesthetic and ecosystem value. So when you think about value on a natural resource, don't just think economic value. Economic value is important. It's very important. Some of the best managed forests I've ever seen are the forests that bring economic value to a landowner, right? But you can't just pin economic value when you look at these natural resources. Look at other values. I've had the opportunity to work on a forest in Mexico that had religious value for the community. And we wrote a management plan. We started thinking about how do we manage this to protect the religious and cultural value of this forest. So value comes in many forms. So vines. Boy, I don't know if I should do it. I'll get back on invasive species again. Why not? So when you think about invasive species, some of the worst culprits are vining species. It's kind of, you know, people ask me what invasive species do I worry most about in this region? And the one I worry most about is Oriental bittersweet, vining Oriental bittersweet. It can cause some major problems. You can have a stand that's infested with Oriental bittersweet. That stand falls down, that stand of trees falls down, wind, and that whole opening can be filled with Oriental bittersweet and not allow regeneration to happen. So again, I want to stress this. I'm not saying invasive species are good. I'm just saying we may have to start rethinking some of these invasive species, especially with climate change, especially with species shifting and species moving. What's going to be an invasive species? If we have species that move up here from Alabama, Florida, some of the deep south, all of a sudden are they going to be invasive species as they move due to climate change, even though they're from our own country? It's an interesting question. So when you think about vines, vines hold on to trees 4 ways, okay? Here's one way. This might look like a live tree, but this is a dead dogwood that's covered with poison ivy. I don't get poison ivy, don't do this at home. But this is poison ivy. It has these aerial roots, and that's how it holds on to trees, through aerial roots right here. Now, honeysuckle and Oriental bittersweet are what we call entwining species. You see how they wrap around? They don't have roots to hold on. They wrap around and entwine the tree and girdle them. Any of you ever see those really fancy walking sticks that have the handle that are spiraled? That's because the honeysuckle or the bittersweet would hold on and the tree would grow around it, and then you take the vines off. So they hold on that way. I don't have grape right now, but grape is a species that holds on through tendrils. It has those, you've all seen them, those corkscrewy like hairs that hold out and wrap around the tree. That's how grape holds on. And then the other one is Virginia creeper. Virginia creeper is fun. If you ever see Virginia creeper on a tree and you see those little hairs that hold on to the trees, pull one off intact and look at the end. The end of it looks like tree frog feet. It's got these little pads, they're called holdfasts, and they're these little adhesive pads that hold on to the tree. They don't go into the tree like the roots of poison ivy, they just hold on. That's why if any of you have masonry around your house, I grew up in New England and it was really common to have English ivy on the outside chimneys of houses and brick houses. Don't put English ivy on your house, because English ivy is another one where the roots, the aerial roots, will go into the masonry, and then when you pull that English ivy off, it'll pull out the masonry. If you put Virginia creeper onto your masonry, you could pull that off, and because it has the holdfast instead of the roots, it won't pull out your masonry. Virginia creeper is also native. It's in the grape family. It provides wildlife habitat, and it also turns a beautiful red in the fall. So that's what I use on my stonework at my house. So this is an interesting spot here. If I was working for a landowner and they asked me to write a wildlife plan for their forest, this would be a feature of the forest that I would key in on and write recommendations for. I don't know if anyone can see, but this is actually human caused. You can see the drill holes where it was drilled and blasted out. This is a rock ledge that was used for rock for campus. It was blown out for rock for campus, as far as I've been told. obviously way before I was here. So let me ask you another question. What day of the year is the sun directly overhead in Asheville? I'll give you some time. What day of the year is the sun directly overhead in Asheville? Think about it. All right, never. Right? The sun, we're not on the equator. The sun is never directly overhead in Asheville. Where we are, at our latitude, the sun is always coming in from the south. So if my elbow is this rock face, the sun will come in at this angle in the summer, it'll come in lower in the winter, it'll only fluctuate like this, right? It'll never turn straight up. So aspect is really important when you're thinking about managing vegetation and habitat. This rock face here is facing due south, which means during the winter, when the leaves are off the trees, it's getting full sun. Well, the branches and the boles of the tree knock it down, so we won't say full, but it gets 70–80% of sunlight that's hitting the surface. So what happens is, this is thermal habitat for wildlife in the winter, because it's going to be warmer than the surrounding regions in the evening, in the surrounding area in the evenings, because it's going to absorb all that solar radiation. And in fact, anecdotally, I've been told that there's been timber rattler dens in here. I don't know how true it is. You know, Warren Wilson's a great place. We have a great verbal history, but I've been told that there was a student who was bitten in here by a rattlesnake. You students, maybe you shouldn't show this to your parents. We don't have rattlesnakes all over campus. But this is a great habitat. And now think about it. Here's another question. Okay, so you want to keep this area sunny and open for wildlife habitat, for thermal wildlife habitat. So if you're out here and you're thinking you need to cut some trees because maybe it's getting a little overgrown, maybe it's getting too shaded, where would you cut the trees? Right? Where? This whole idea of aspect, this whole idea of direction of the sun. You know, if you cut the trees directly above it, what you're going to do is you're going to open up a big sunny patch behind it, because again, the angle of the sun. So actually, if we want to open this up, and we don't have to do it yet, but if in coming years the forest gets more dense, we may have to open this up, we'd actually cut trees on this side of it, so that the gap, the sunlight that comes in at the angle, will shoot across and hit this from there. Again, aspect is so important when you're managing an ecosystem. Are you on the north side of a ridge? Are you on the south side of a ridge? Is really, really important. Any of you who know in the winter in this area, when you drive, you come around the north side of a ridge and you come from the south side of the ridge to the north side of the ridge, you better be careful because you're going to get ice. Again, that has to do with aspect. So has anyone ever noticed things are starting to flush, right? Leaves are starting to flush. Anyone know what this is? If any of my forest bio students are watching, you better know what this is. One trick you could do is you can scrape off the cambium on one of the new branches and smell it, and it smells like bitter almond. This is black cherry. This is a cherry tree. And the smell you're getting, the bitter almond, is cyanic acid. So it's a good test for it. So you have to be careful. There's a lot of non-native cherry trees that have come out into the forest that have escaped. So some of you might notice that some trees leaf out before other trees. And I'm not talking pines, I'm talking hardwoods. Cherry is an example of a tree that leaves out pretty early. Red maple leaves out pretty early. A lot of birches leaf out very early. Whereas if you come and see something like a walnut or an oak, you'll notice that they leaf out much later than these other species. Anyone know why? Any guesses on why? Well, I'll tell you why. It's the plumbing. It has to do with the tree's plumbing. So many of you have probably seen a stump and tried to read the rings on a stump. Well, what those rings are made up of is what's called xylem cells, which is the cells that transport water up and down the stem of the tree. So on some trees, those cells are very, very small, very small. And on some trees, those would be diffuse porous trees. And on some trees, those rings are very, very large, comparably. They're still small, but they're large compared to the other ones. So what happens is, during the winter, the trees that have large xylem cells, big pipes, when you get freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, what happens is the gas in the water that's in those pipes comes out of the water, and it breaks those cells. Think about drinking a straw with a milkshake and putting a bunch of holes in it. Sooner or later, you won't be able to move any water up and down. Whereas with the small cells, because they're so small, those gas bubbles don't get big, and so it doesn't break the water column in the xylem cells on those trees. So in the spring, the trees that have the very small xylem cells still have working plumbing and can start moving water up so that they can leaf out very quickly. Whereas the trees that have the bigger cells, like the oaks and the walnuts, they have to put on new plumbing before they can really start pumping water up to leaf out. And that's why you see these trees leafing out before the oaks. There's another, I'll tell you another tale that could end sadly, at least for those of you who get poison ivy. Vines. Anyone ever hike to very high elevations or go up into Maine, Canada? You don't see a lot of vines at high elevation or in colder latitudes. So let me back up a little bit. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Going up in elevation, for plants and for trees, going up in elevation is the same as going north in latitude. It has the same effect on vegetation and what grows where. Mark Brenner, our great ecologist here at the college, he teaches a course called, a lab called Asheville to Canada in 3 hours. So if you drive from Asheville to Mount Mitchell, you go through the same 3 forest types that you would go through if you drove from Asheville to Maine. We here in Asheville are in the oak hickory forest type. And then as you go up and you hit about 4,000 feet, 4,500 feet, you hit northern hardwood. Has anyone ever driven on the parkway in the fall and all of a sudden you hit a point where the world turns yellow? That's because the northern hardwood forest is dominated by birch and beech. And then you go up above northern hardwood and you get into the spruce fir forest. Well, if you drive from here, you're going to be in oak hickory until you hit Vermont, upper Massachusetts, then you're going to hit northern hardwood, and then once you get up into Maine, you're going to hit fir forest. So latitude has the same effect as elevation. One of the things driving that again is plumbing, right? The trees down here in Asheville, generally speaking, have much bigger xylem cells than the spruce and the fir that's up at the top. So a lot of these trees, these hardwood trees, can't handle the freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw that occurs at higher elevation. And again, it's because of the plumbing. Getting back to vines, you don't see a lot of vines in northern latitudes or up in high elevation because vines have big plumbing. If you ever cut a grapevine, a big-sized grapevine, and if you cut it thin enough, you can almost see through the xylem cells. Large cells are great for moving large amounts of water, but they don't do well in cold environments. So one of the things that could happen down the road, people have talked about, is vines moving higher in elevation and vines moving higher in latitude. And what that could mean down the road is things like poison ivy could have a wider spread than it does right now because it could get into some of our high elevations and into some of our colder northern forests. So that's something to watch out for. But it's kind of interesting to think that what it really comes down to quite often is the physiology and the structure, the anatomy of the trees themselves. So another pretty good indication of a shade-tolerant tree, or at least a tree that's trying to persist in a shade-tolerant environment. This is a dogwood. This is Cornus, Florida. Beautiful tree. You'll notice, if you can't get leaves and you want to see if it's a dogwood, dogwood has these opposite leaves that come out. But also, if you look, the branches are opposite and they come out in V's. Right? You might be able to see that on the dogwood. But if you can see from the video, you notice how this tree isn't growing like this. It's not growing pointed like this. It's growing out flat like this. We call that planar growth, right? It flattens out. Here's a tree that does not experience in planar growth. You can see how it goes straight up. This one right here. So they do that. Shade-tolerant trees will do that so that they don't self-shade and they can take advantage of all the light they can get. Think about it this way. If you're like this and growing, your top leaves are going to shade your lower leaves. And you're not going to be able to spread out and get all the light you can. Whereas if you grow like this and you spread out, now all of a sudden you're not going to do self-shading and you're going to have this planar growth that puts more of your photo panels, puts more of your photosynthesis apparatus out to the sun, right? So it's more efficient for capturing light. Think of lying on a beach. When you want to get a suntan, do you stand on the beach or do you lie on the beach? Right? You lie on the beach because you want to increase your surface area to the sun. So dogwood will grow like this. You have to be careful. It's not just shade-tolerant plants that'll do that. Sometimes a tree will grow that needs light that can perform that type of growth, which it wouldn't be typical just to try and survive, but quite often they'll drop out and they won't make it. Here's another tree ID tip. If you're trying to identify oaks when there's no leaves, look at the tips of some branches. Can you see this? You see how there's a whole bunch of buds all clumped at the tip of the twig? That's a characteristic of oaks. It's not going to tell you which oak. You have to go deeper into it. But when you look at a tree in the winter and you're trying to decide what it is, if you see what I call the stegosaurus tail, it looks like a stegosaurus tail to me. This is a great example of you can get it to an oak. This one here is probably one of the red oak groups, but I'd have to go deeper into it. Ooh, here's a pretty wildflower. These are anemones. They also come up early. It's in the Ranunculaceae family. Beautiful, beautiful flower. If anyone ever gets a chance to spend time in the forest with Amy Boyd, our great botanist, if you get a chance to be out in the woods looking at wildflowers with Amy, sharpen your pencil and make sure you have lots of paper for taking notes on. She's incredible to be out in the woods with. So we made it to the top of Broyles Ridge. We walked up from the soccer field, those of you who know campus, walked up to the top. And what you'll notice is Broyles Ridge has an east-west spine to it that you walk across when you go down this way. And that's really important also for invasive species management. Understanding that you can use your landscape features as a management tool. And what I mean by that is, you might have noticed when we walked up and we showed the south side of the ridge, all of the undergrowth, all of the vegetation and the vines that were growing at head height down on this side. But if you look over to the north side, you would notice that it's much cleaner, okay? you'll notice you don't have the mess of invasive species on the north side of the ridge that we do on the south side of the ridge. And that's really not due to any management. That's purely due to aspect. Again, the south side of the ridge gets a lot of solar energy, a lot of light, and so most of our invasive species in the forest thrive in high light areas. They're not shade tolerant. They thrive in high light areas. So this south side always gets light all day, and it's really infested with invasive species. But if you look over to this side on the north, it's pretty clean. And that's only because northern ridges are low energy, low light environments, and most of our invasive species can't persist in that environment. Which begs a question, you know, in management. Do you focus your energy? The thing you'll learn is in conservation, you always have X amount of conservation dollars, and it's never enough. Where do you spend X amount of conservation dollars? You know, the question is, do you spend your conservation dollars removing invasive species from this south side, which is going to be a continual effort over time, or do you focus your conservation dollars on keeping this north side clear of invasive species, which is going to be much easier and is going to stretch your conservation dollars much further? These are the gives and takes in conservation and in management that we all deal with. Now, I want to make sure folks know that I understand invasive species can be a vector for spread, obviously. But I'm not that worried about the invasive species, the rose, the honeysuckle, the bittersweet, really transferring to this side because it's such a low energy environment. So hopefully you enjoyed your hike up Broyles Ridge today. We'll do this some more. I want to thank Pete. Pete's been great. Follow me around. We're going to put these on the Conservation Exchange and some other formats. And maybe we'll open up a question. Ask me questions and I'll get back to you on the Conservation Exchange and we could talk more about this. Quite possibly, I said some things during this talk. I have a lot of opinions. Hopefully you understand the difference between scientific fact and Dave's opinion on things, and I'm happy to talk about those anytime.